I've been to funerals with more sincerity than that dinner. The private room at Harbor Club in Annapolis felt like a corporate boardroom dressed up for a wedding. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light. Polished mahogany reflected faces I didn't recognize. My name is Ray Kessler. I'm 47, State Corrections Lieutenant with 23 years of service. I'd just finished a double shift and drove straight here in my uniform. Ben had insisted on the venue. My brother, 39, rising tech COO at Urban Frame, clean cut, curated, everything calculated for maximum impression. His fiancée, Sarah, came from federal money. Her father was Judge Morrison, retired from the district court. The kind of connections that open doors before you even knock. I took a seat near the back. The fabric still smelled like the cell block. Ben stood at the head table, champagne flute raised. His smile was camera ready. The room quieted like an audience waiting for the show. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began. His voice carried that practiced executive tone. "Sarah and I are building something beautiful together." A light applause rippled through the room. "We're surrounded by people who've shaped our lives. Federal judges, policy advisors, business leaders." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering on the judges' table. Then his eyes found me. "And thanks to my brother Ray, still playing dress-up for a living?" The words hit the air like a slap. Muted chuckles followed. Not cruel laughter, just the kind of nervous amusement that fills awkward spaces. I didn't move, didn't speak, just lifted my glass toward him. "Congrats, man," my voice cut through the quiet. Steady, professional, the same tone I used during lockdown procedures. Ben's smile flickered. For just a second, something uncertain crossed his face. That's when the door opened. Governor Dane stepped inside. Late, but not apologetic. His security detail remained in the hallway while he paused at the entrance. The room shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Most guests glanced toward Ben, expecting the governor to make his way to the head table. Instead, Dane's eyes found me. He walked past Judge Morrison's table, past the policy advisors and business leaders, past Ben, who stood frozen with his champagne glass still raised. "Lieutenant Kessler." The governor extended his hand. "Always good to see you." I stood, shook his hand. "Governor, how's the reform initiative coming along? Your pilot program's generating real interest at the state level." The room went silent. Every conversation died. Every eye focused on our exchange. "Just doing the work, sir." "Good man. We'll talk soon." He patted my shoulder once, then moved toward the judge's table. I sat back down. The room slowly remembered how to breathe. Ben's toast had ended without fanfare. He found his seat, but his face had gone pale. Sarah whispered something in his ear. He nodded, but his eyes kept drifting back to me. The dinner continued around us. Conversations resumed in careful, measured tones, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Judge Morrison approached my table during dessert. "Lieutenant, I've heard excellent things about your work in corrections reform." "Thank you, sir. Innovation in that field is long overdue. Takes real vision to see past the old systems." I nodded, said nothing more. After he walked away, I caught Ben watching me again. His jaw was tight. His hands gripped his napkin like he was trying not to let go of something. The evening wound down in small clusters. Handshakes and business cards, promises to stay in touch, the usual political theater. Ben found me near the coat check. We were alone for the first time all night. "Nice show," he said. His executive polish had worn thin. "Just dinner." "The governor thing, very convenient timing." I looked at him, really looked at him. Same face I'd grown up with, but something different behind the eyes now. "You think I planned that?" "Did you?" I didn't answer. Just put on my jacket and walked toward the door. "Ray?" His voice stopped me. "We should talk soon." "About work stuff?" "Sure." I left him standing there. Outside, The November air cut through my uniform. Harbor lights reflected off the water in broken lines. My truck sat alone at the far end of the parking lot. I'd driven here thinking this was just another family obligation, a dinner to endure, a toast to survive. Instead, I'd watched my brother reveal something I hadn't expected to see. What did he mean by work stuff? What did he know about my reform pilot that made him so nervous after the governor's visit? The engine turned over on the first try. Radio stayed off, just the sound of tires on asphalt, and my own breathing in the dark. Power doesn't need volume. That night, it walked past him. The call came 3 months before Ben's engagement dinner. I was reviewing incident reports when my phone buzzed. Mike Torres, retired DOC colleague. We'd worked the same block for 8 years before he took his pension. "Ray, weird question for you." His voice carried that careful tone you use when you're fishing for information without asking directly. "What's up, Mike? Did you give your brother access to the sandbox?" Some consultant pinged our metrics yesterday. Language looked oddly familiar. I set down my pen. The sandbox was our internal testing repository. Vendor access required clearance levels most consultants never saw. "No." "Why?" "Probably nothing. But the phrasing reminded me of your reform stuff. Just checking." After he hung up, I sat in my office for 20 minutes, staring at the wall, processing. That's when I began building the net, but I said nothing, not even to Donna. The pieces started falling into place 2 weeks after the dinner. Janet Walsh from the governor's office called about budget allocations. Routine conversation. Then she mentioned something that made my blood stop. "Oh, by the way, Urban Frame submitted a pitch for state corrections reform. Impressive proposal, very aligned with current thinking." Urban Frame, Ben's company. I thanked her and hung up, pulled up my secure access terminal, cross-referenced the state vendor database with Urban Frame's recent submissions. There it was, a 40-page reform platform proposal, submitted 6 weeks ago. I opened the document, read the first paragraph, then the second. The language wasn't just similar to my internal pilot, it was nearly identical. But here's the thing. I wasn't shocked. I was ready. That night, I drove home through empty streets. My house sat dark at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The garage door opened with its familiar groan. I needed to see something I'd kept locked away for 3 years. The wooden file box sat on a high shelf, behind paint cans and Christmas decorations. I pulled it down, set it on my workbench under the fluorescent light. Inside, my cadet badge, old performance reviews, commendation letters, and at the bottom, a manila folder marked draft internal use only. I opened it. The pages were yellow at the edges now, but the handwritten notes in the margins were still clear. Dad's handwriting. Frank Kessler, corrections officer for 31 years. He'd died before finishing his reform ideas, but he'd left his notes. Low violence, lower recidivism. The goal isn't release, it's return. His words written in careful block letters, the foundation for everything I'd built since. I'd used his notes as the backbone for my pilot program. Quietly, systematically. Never told Ben about Dad's work. Never tried to prove anything to anyone. Ben knew I was working on reform initiatives, but he'd never seen the original documents. Never knew where the ideas came from. How did he get access to my pilot? And why did he think he could use it without consequences? I whispered to the empty garage. He thought Dad wanted to be remembered. I just wanted him understood. But sitting there under the harsh light, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and old wood, I realized something else. Mike's call hadn't been random. Someone had been watching. Someone had noticed the similarities between my work and whatever Urban Frame was selling. Time to give them something better to notice. I spent the next hour at my computer. First, I archived my official pilot under restricted internal access. Code locked it behind clearance levels that required 3-person authorization, and then I opened a new document. started typing. This version would be different. Same basic framework, same core concepts, but with outdated statistics. Embedded phrasing that would trigger specific recognition patterns. Language only one person would immediately identify. Donna Stein, State Procurement Auditor. We'd worked together on vendor compliance reviews for 5 years. She knew my writing style better than anyone in state government. I uploaded this bait draft to a controlled vendor access repository. The sandbox wasn't public in the usual sense. It was designed for testing alignment models. Consultants used it to gauge compatibility with state priorities. I logged it through a liaison account used for draft circulation. Technically clean, practically forgotten, but accessible to anyone with vendor-level clearance. Then I waited. Donna called me 4 days later. Her voice was tight with the kind of controlled anger she reserved for major violations. "Ray, we need to talk. In person." We met at a coffee shop near the State House. She slid a folder across the table without preamble. "Look at this." Inside were printed pages, side-by-side comparisons. My bait draft on the left, Urban Frame's proposal on the right, identical phrasing, identical structure. Even the outdated statistics matched perfectly. "The stolen language went through a consultant who worked on both ends," she said. "Marcus Webb. He's got ties to Urban Frame through a subcontract arrangement." I studied the documents. Every embedded phrase had been lifted verbatim. Every carefully placed marker I had included as proof of origin. "How long has this been happening?" "At least 6 months, maybe longer. Webb's been accessing the sandbox under legitimate vendor research, but he's been mining our internal development work." She leaned forward. "Ray, this isn't just plagiarism. This is systematic theft of state intellectual property for private profit." I closed the folder, handed it back to her. "What do you need from me?" "Official documentation, timestamps, access logs. Everything that proves your work predates their submission." "You'll have it by tomorrow." She studied my face. "You don't seem surprised by this." "Should I be?" "Most people would be furious. Your brother's company just stole years of your work." I stood up, left money on the table for coffee I hadn't touched. "Fury doesn't solve problems, Donna. Documentation does." That night I sat in my garage again. The file box was still open on my workbench. Dad's notes spread out under the light. Ben had thought he was stealing a plan, something he could rebrand and sell to the highest bidder. But plans are just blueprints, and blueprints can be designed to fail. I'd given him exactly what he wanted, a path to success built on my work, my reputation, my family's legacy. Except this path had fracture lines built into its foundation. They took the blueprint. I left them the blueprint with a fracture line. Urban Frame's press release hit the wire on a Tuesday morning. Revolutionary Reform Platform Pilots in State Modernization Initiative. The headline read. Ben's headshot accompanied the announcement. Positioned as Chief Innovation Officer, leading breakthrough corrections technology. I read it twice. Every word calculated for maximum impact. Every claim designed to position Urban Frame as the future of criminal justice reform. They were going public with stolen work. My work. Dad's work. 2 weeks later, Ben spoke at a closed policy roundtable. State legislators, federal advisors, corrections officials from 3 neighboring states. The kind of audience that shapes budget allocations and policy directions. I wasn't invited, but I knew someone who was. Dr. Patricia Hayes, Corrections Research Director. We'd collaborated on data analysis for 5 years. She owed me nothing but professional courtesy, ran deep in our field. Mind if I ask a favor, Patricia? What do you need, Ray? Ben's presenting today. Could you record his presentation for review purposes? She hesitated. That's unusual. I understand. Just thought I'd ask. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed. A secure file transfer notification. Ben's presentation deck, 43 slides. Complete audio recording. I opened the first slide. Innovative pathways. Next Generation Corrections Reform. By slide 7, I was taking screenshots. By slide 15, I was documenting timestamps. By the end, I had 17 exact matches to my bait draft, not just similar concepts, verbatim language, even the deliberately outdated statistics I'd embedded as markers. Ben had lifted entire sections without changing a single word. I compiled everything into a detailed comparison report. Side-by-side documentation, time-stamped access logs from the sandbox, cross-reference dates between my original work and Urban Shreem's submissions. Sent it to Donna that evening. She filed an audit request the next morning. Quietly, through official channels. The kind of procedural review that happens in bureaucratic shadows. Internal investigation began within a week, slowly, methodically, the way government moves when it's being careful. Then it stalled. Donna called me 3 weeks later. Her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before. "We've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The compliance officer backing our audit request? James Morrison. He's been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Morrison, same last name as the judge, Ben's future father-in-law. Conflict of interest? That's what they're calling it. But here's the thing, Ray. I've been warned. I waited. My supervisor pulled me aside yesterday, said my focus on this vendor is starting to look personal. The system doesn't say stop, it says back off. Translation, the investigation was being buried, not killed outright, just suffocated under administrative procedure and bureaucratic pressure. "What's your next move?" "Not sure I have one, at least not through official channels." I sat in my office that night, staring at the audit report on my computer screen. Months of work, documented theft, clear evidence of systematic fraud, all of it disappearing into the same bureaucratic maze that protected connected families and well-funded companies. But I'd planned for this possibility. 3 years ago, CivicScope had contacted me about my reform pilot. They were a nonprofit watchdog focused on government accountability, specifically interested in corrections reform and vendor oversight. I'd said no then. Didn't want my work politicized or used for agenda-driven reporting. This time was different. I found their original email in my archives. Dr. Amanda Foster, investigative director. Still at the same organization, still focused on the same issues. I composed a new message. Anonymous sender account. Encrypted attachment. Enclosed, documented evidence of state intellectual property theft by private vendor. Timestamp proof of plagiarism in corrections reform proposals. Vendor has family connections to state judiciary. Internal audit stalled due to conflict of interest. Source requests anonymity but can provide additional verification if needed. I attached everything. The comparison report, Ben's presentation audio, Sandback's access logs, Donna's preliminary audit findings, everything except my name. Sent it at 2 a.m. from a coffee shop across town. CivicScope responded within 48 hours. Professional, thorough. They wanted to verify sources and cross-check documentation before moving forward. I provided what they needed, still anonymously, still carefully. Meanwhile, Donna was conducting her own investigation, outside official channels, using personal connections and professional networks to dig deeper into UrbanFrame's background. What she found changed everything. She called me on a Friday evening. I was in my garage, organizing Dad's old files. "Ray, I need to see you. Tonight." We met at the same coffee shop, different table, same corner booth. She brought a manila envelope thick with documents. "Legal ownership records for UrbanFrame," she said. "Took some digging, but I found the original incorporation papers." I opened the envelope. Corporate filing documents, financial disclosure forms, investor agreements. There, buried in the third page of investor documentation, Morrison Family Trust. Initial seed funding of $2,800,000. 0 cents. Judge Morrison, Ben's future father-in-law. Not just a family connection, a financial partner. This wasn't just Ben freelancing, Tana continued. This was systemic acquisition. They targeted your work specifically because they knew it had state backing and federal potential. I studied the documents. The timeline was clear. Urban Frames Incorporation happened 6 months after my pilot program received preliminary state approval. The Morrison Trust investment came 2 months later. They'd been watching, planning, positioning themselves to profit from work they'd never done. How long have they been planning this? At least a year, maybe longer. The consultant arrangements, the vendor access, the family connections, it's all connected. I closed the envelope, handed it back. Keep digging, I'll handle the rest. That night, I made a decision. No more anonymous reports. No more bureaucratic channels. No more waiting for systems that protected the connected and ignored the truth. Time for a personal message. I went to my garage, pulled out Dad's original draft, the one with his handwritten notes in the margins, the one Ben had never seen. I scanned the signature page, Dad's careful handwriting visible in the margins, his thoughts about reform, about justice, about doing work that mattered more than recognition. Low violence, low recidivism. The goal isn't release, it's return. I attached the scan to a simple email, no subject line, no explanation, just the image. Sent it to Ben's personal account, no words, just the ink. Let him explain how he developed ideas identical to concepts our father had drafted before Ben even knew what corrections reform meant. Let him explain how his innovative platform matched notes written in a dead man's handwriting. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later, Ben's number. I let it ring. He called 3 more times that night. Left no voicemails. I sat in my garage until dawn, surrounded by Dad's papers and my own documentation, the smell of motor oil and old wood, the fluorescent light humming overhead. Ben thought he'd stolen a plan, something he could rebrand and profit from, something he could use to build his reputation and secure his future. But plans are just blueprints, and some blueprints lead to graveyards. He thought he stole a plan. He walked into a graveyard I never buried. CivicScope published on a Wednesday morning. State proposal plagiarized by private vendor? Internal pilot data stolen. Source confirms. The headline appeared at 6 a.m. By 8 a.m., it was trending on policy forums. By noon, 3 major news outlets had picked up the story. The article was surgical, precise. Every claim backed by documentation I'd provided anonymously. Side-by-side comparisons of my bait draft and Urban Frames proposal, timestamp proof of intellectual property theft. Ben's name appeared 17 times, always in connection with alleged plagiarism and corporate misconduct. The story spread faster than Urban Frame could respond, faster than their legal team could craft denials. Social media amplified every detail. Government accountability groups shared the findings. Corrections professionals who recognized my work style began connecting dots publicly. By Thursday afternoon, the governor's office issued a statement. All contracts with vendors named in today's CivicScope report are temporarily suspended pending internal review. Urban Frame's reform platform disappeared from the state agenda, just gone, like it had never existed. I watched the collapse from my office, reading updates between routine paperwork. Each news alert another domino falling in a sequence I'd designed months earlier. My phone stayed silent. No reporters called. No one connected Lieutenant Ray Kessler to the anonymous source behind CivicScope's investigation. That was intentional. I'd been careful to keep my name out of the documentation trail, let the evidence speak without requiring my testimony. Ben's collapse was quiet but thorough. Sarah's family withdrew their support within 48 hours. Judge Morrison released a statement through his attorney. The Morrison family had no knowledge of Urban Frame's questionable business practices and will be divesting all financial interests immediately. Translation: they were cutting Ben loose to protect their own reputation. His legal advisors recommended he resign for optics. Urban Frames Board agreed. By Friday, Ben Kessler was no longer listed as Chief Innovation Officer on the company website. The State Procurement Board issued a moratorium on urban frame bidding for all future contracts. Effective immediately, no appeal process. Corporate death sentence delivered in bureaucratic language. I said nothing throughout the entire process. Never spoke to reporters, never issued statements, never appeared in any coverage. The work spoke for itself. 3 weeks later, an internal memo arrived in my email. State Corrections Reform Initiative. Executive Authorization. Governor Dane had signed off on a new reform program. Same basic framework as my original pilot. Same core concepts Dad had outlined in his handwritten notes. But this version was tagged under state authorship. No vendor involvement. No private contracts. The initiative would be named after the Franklin Kessler Corrections District. Dad's old assignment. The place where he'd spent 31 years trying to build something better. I read the memo twice. No ceremony. No public announcement. Just quiet government efficiency. Implementing ideas that should have been implemented years ago. A single line near the bottom caught my attention. We credit long-serving officers for building the foundation of this reform. That afternoon, Donna called. "You see the memo?" I saw it. The revised plan passed after a quiet 3-week review by the Compliance Board. Stripped of all prior vendor affiliation. Clean slate. Good. "Who's Ray?" Her voice carried something I couldn't identify. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? The work preserved, your father's legacy protected." I looked out my office window. Concrete walls and razor wire, the same view I'd stared at for 23 years. It was never about what I wanted. 2 months later, I received an invitation to a reform policy lunch. State Capitol building, formal dining room reserved for legislative events. I arrived 15 minutes late. Traffic had been heavier than expected, and I'd needed to finish an incident report before leaving. The dining room was full of familiar faces. Governor Dane at the podium, state legislators scattered throughout the crowd, federal advisors and policy researchers occupying the front tables. I paused in the doorway, scanning for an open seat in the back. "Lieutenant Kessler," a voice called from the front of the room. "Your table is up here." The crowd turned. Every eye in the room focused on me as I walked forward. My name was on a placard at the head table, right side of the governor, the seat reserved for honored guests. I sat down without acknowledgement, adjusted my napkin, waited for attention to shift elsewhere. That's when I saw him. Ben sat near the back of the room, same table where I would have been placed months earlier. He wore a different suit now. Cheaper fabric, less confident posture. He was staring at me, but his expression was unreadable. Not angry, not ashamed, just empty. When I entered, no one had turned to look at him. No one acknowledged his presence. He'd become invisible in a room full of people who'd once competed for his attention. Governor Dane's speech focused on long-term reform strategy, evidence-based policy, the importance of institutional knowledge and experienced officers. Real change happens when we listen to the people who've dedicated their careers to making our system work better, he said. Today's initiative builds on foundations laid by officers who never sought recognition, only results. Polite applause followed. I didn't clap, just sat quietly while others acknowledged work that had been mine from the beginning. After the speech, people approached my table, handshakes and business cards, conversations about implementation timelines and budget allocations. Ben never approached, never tried to make eye contact again. When the lunch ended, he left through a side door while I was still talking with the governor's staff. I drove home through afternoon traffic, thinking about Dad's notes, his careful handwriting, his belief that reform should be invisible when done right. He'd been correct. The best work happens in shadows. Changes systems without changing headlines, improves lives without generating applause. Ben had wanted applause, recognition, credit for innovation he'd never earned. All I kept was the work. The initiative would help reduce recidivism, improve officer safety, create pathways for genuine rehabilitation instead of just warehousing people until their sentences expired. Dad's vision, implemented through state systems, protected from private profit and corporate manipulation. That evening, I sat in my garage with the wooden file box open beside me, added the lunch invitation to the collection of documents inside. His name would be on buildings now. The Franklin Kessler Corrections District would serve as a permanent reminder of what one officer could accomplish through decades of quiet service. Ben's name would fade from memory. Urban Frame would rebuild with different leadership and different strategies. The scandal would become a footnote in procurement reform discussions. But the work would continue. The real work. The kind that changes lives without changing headlines. He wanted applause. All I kept was the work. 6 months later, I found myself in the garage again. Late night. The house was quiet. My shift had ended at 11, but sleep wouldn't come. Too much energy. Too many thoughts circling without landing. I pulled the wooden file box down from its shelf. Same box I'd opened months earlier, when this all began. Heavier now, somehow. I set it on my workbench under the fluorescent light. Opened the lid with the same careful precision I used for everything else. The contents had grown. My cadet badge still sat in the corner, tarnished but intact. 23 years of service condensed into a small piece of metal and fabric. The bait draft was there too. The document that had brought Ben down. Pages that looked innocent enough but contained fracture lines designed to collapse under scrutiny. And now, Dad's original handwritten page. Folded and fragile, yellowed at the edges where my fingers had touched it too many times. I unfolded it carefully, his handwriting still clear despite the years. Block letters formed with the precision of someone who'd spent decades filling out incident reports. Low violence, lower recidivism. The goal isn't release, it's return. His philosophy in 12 words. Everything I'd built my career around. Everything Ben had tried to steal and rebrand. But there was another line I'd never paid attention to before. Smaller text in the margin, written in pencil instead of pen. True reform is invisible when done right. You won't get thanked, just keep going. I read it twice, then a third time. Dad had understood something I was only beginning to grasp. Real change doesn't come with ceremonies or recognition. It happens in the spaces between headlines, in the quiet decisions that shape systems. He'd never sought credit for his ideas, never tried to build a legacy around his name. He'd just done the work, the same way I'd handled Ben's betrayal. No public confrontations, no emotional outbursts, just systematic documentation and strategic patience. The work had survived. The reforms were being implemented. Dad's vision would help people he'd never meet in facilities he'd never see. I reached for the state memo, the one announcing the Franklin Kessler Correction District initiative. His name on something permanent now, something that would outlast scandal and politics. I placed it in the box with everything else. Documents that told a story no one would ever read in full. Evidence of a quiet war fought with policy papers and procedural reviews. Then I closed the lid, reached for the roll of packaging tape I kept on the shelf, sealed the box shut with long strips across the top and sides. No one else was watching. No witnesses to this small ritual. Just me, and the smell of motor oil and old wood. I lifted the box back to its shelf. Higher this time, behind paint cans that hadn't been opened in years, where it would stay until someone else needed to understand what had happened here. Turned off the fluorescent light. The garage went dark except for a thin line of streetlight under the door. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. No explanations needed, no speeches to give, just stillness. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the city. Night shift workers heading home, early shift workers heading out. The machinery of society moving forward without fanfare. Same way real reform works. Same way real justice gets served. Ben had mocked the uniform at that dinner, called it plain dress-up, made jokes for people who measured success by applause and recognition. But the uniform represented something he'd never understand. Service without ego. Work without glory. The kind of strength that doesn't need an audience. They mocked the uniform. But the man who wore it never needed the room.